Hello and welcome to another episode of the PwC Leadership Exchange. Today we're discussing the upcoming UK election and potential impacts on business with Anna Wallace. We're recording this on Thursday, May the 30th, 2024. Things may have changed by the time you listen to the webcast. My guest today is Anna Wallace. She's a German and politics graduate who has spent over 15 years advising businesses on politics and policy, helping them connect the political world and what it means for their business strategy. And has worked on some of the biggest hot-button political issues of our generation, from working with the government on setting up, the UK government on setting up youth mentoring schemes during the great financial crisis, through to leading a government-backed business commission looking at recovery post-COVID. Anna spent 6 years at PwC UK advising our business and clients, particularly during Brexit. Most recently, she was a partner at a leading boutique agency, Hanbury Strategy. Anna, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let's start with some context on this UK election. Can you frame this election for us at a high level?
Yeah, of course. Well, we'll pretend that you and I knew something that other people didn't when we booked in this webcast, because of course Sunak has gone a lot earlier than people expected him to. So we now have an election date of the 4th of July. Most bets were looking at an autumn election. It seems like he has gone early against the advice of most of the people around his cabinet table, around people like Isaac Levido, who masterminded most of the Conservative victories of the last few years. At the time of recording, we're yet to see the manifestos from either party, so we can't get into the detailed policy discussion. But we've seen the contours from both sides. Labour have launched their 6 missions, 6 steps. It seems to be various sort of names that they're giving those. And the Conservatives focusing on things like military service, around protecting pensions primarily, and a big debate today around things like interest rates and economic policy. I think one thing that's quite interesting for me is whatever the outcome of the election, we're going to have a lot of changes to the faces on the parliamentary estate. We've got 80 Conservative MPs who have already confirmed that they are stepping down. That's more than we saw in 1997. And that includes some really big names like former Prime Minister Theresa May, Dominic Raab, Michael Gove, Ben Wallace. So either way, we're set for a change in the summer.
Huge. And it really, certainly no one expected it to come at this time, but Labour are starting with a 20-point lead in the polls, right? So even more baffling that it chose to go just at this moment. What would it take? Is there any scenario where we don't have a Labour government?
I think it would take a lot. I think it's Starmer's to lose, really. I think we would all be quite shocked if we woke up and had another Conservative government on the 5th of July, or to be honest, even a hung parliament.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think probably since Sunak came to power, his job really has been to make it less bad than it could otherwise be, both in terms of the economic impact post the Truss quasi-Kwarteng budget, but also looking to the election in terms of the Conservatives' prospects over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Can he do enough to give the Conservatives a fighting chance of coming back at the next election? Or is this going to be a 1997 moment where they're out in the wilderness for a long time?
And I think that's what everybody on the Conservative side is thinking right now, because normally if you're the incumbent, you go to and say, we're doing a great job, don't trust them, give us another go. But even Sunak, he can't get the immigration under control, creaking NHS, challenges with the military and defence posture. There's a lot that people will look at and go, your numbers aren't right.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, look, for me, there is a lot between Sunak and Gordon Brown, the sort of couple of years that Gordon Brown was in power, which is where, again, they're perhaps managerial people, don't necessarily have a very clear vision for what it is that they want to achieve with the country. So what the public are left with is a kind of question of, well, you can't be a change candidate, because otherwise why wouldn't you have changed it already? And if you're a continuity candidate, then I'm not sure that I want more of what you're selling.
Yes. So highly likely Labour come out as the biggest party, size of majority to be determined. Conservatives are going to take a beating, but they're really thinking about the election after. But let's talk to some of the people who could spoil that whole scenario, right? So I'm thinking of the Lib Dems, Reform and the SNP. Just give me a quick run through on the other parties.
So I think Reform, personally I'm sceptical if they will actually win many, if any, seats. But what they might do is in a couple of key seats, they might gobble up just enough votes from the Conservative Party to allow Labour to come through the middle. And that's interesting because for Labour, you know, what they've got to do successfully in this election is not just win back some of the red wall seats, but they need to win some of the suburban and even rural seats to secure a decent size majority. So, but a reform also, perhaps we'll get into it, will potentially have a bit of a squeeze on policy, as Nigel Farage has been incredibly successful in British politics in the last few years. The Lib Dems, I think, if you speak to people in the party, they have high ambitions and high hopes that they're going to double or even maybe triple the 11 MPs that they currently have in Parliament. I don't know whether I'm that optimistic for them, but I do think it's telling that some of those names that I mentioned at the top of our discussion are in seats that will absolutely be targets for the Liberal Democrats. In particular, some of those constituencies that sit sort of on the outskirts of London, on the edges of the home counties, places like Dominic Raab's seats in Esher and Walton, places like Michael Gove's in Surrey. If I was the Lib Dem party, this would be exactly where I was targeting. And of course, absolutely, we should mention the SNP, currently the third party in Westminster. Remains to be seen if they can retain that position post-election. I think the most recent polling coming out of Scotland has Labour about 7 points ahead of them. So certainly Labour gains north of the border, which is obviously critical. That's been a real boon in the side of the Labour Party for the last few years, and a roadblock in their path to power. So gains in Scotland versus the SNP are really significant for the potential of a Labour government.
Absolutely. I want to come back, and as you said, I want to come back to reform, and I want to come back in a few moments to economic trade and foreign policy if we take the assumption of a Labour win. But before we do that, there's huge talk, and it seems to dominate the social and cultural and the media around immigration policy. Just what's going on, and why is it dominating the conversation so much?
Good question, because there are two different things going on here. There are some immigration elements like asylum that members of the public care about, and then there are lots of other sort of immigration, or actually more broadly cultural issues that the public don't care about. And I think you're absolutely right to identify this as dominating the public debate. I mean, if I think about the front pages of the British media, even just in the last few weeks, you would think that this was a topic that every man and woman up and down the street cared about. Actually, that's just not borne out by the polling. People care much more about, first and foremost, cost of living, NHS, but also local issues like antisocial behaviour, even things like sewage becoming much bigger features of the political landscape as the water companies are sort of over the rack. But I think, look, what do I think? I think there is definitely an element of culture wars being used here to fill column inches in absence of other ideas. And I think that's definitely going to be a feature of this election. We're obviously operating in a massively fiscally constrained environment. That means that there's not a lot of money for the stuff that you would normally have at election time, be that tax cuts on the one side or big spending pledges for new policy ideas on the other side. So for both parties, there aren't many levers, or at least there's nothing at the end of the lever that you could ordinarily pull on. So there's a bit perhaps of using culture wars to fill that space otherwise. I mean, let's be real. There is a role for politics here, and there is a bit of each party speaking to its base. So, for example, there's some interesting polling that shows if you tell Labour voters that the current government is racist, that it will encourage them to go out and vote Labour. Similarly, if you see some of the issues like immigration, like things around gender identity, the Conservatives tend to pen op-eds in the Daily Mail and the Sun. That's because they think red wall voters care about those topics. So in some ways there is some role for it in terms of activating the base, but actually in general the British public don't care about this. They see it as desperate, they see it as a distraction, and the polling would show that this is really something that's being driven by the fringes.
And just before we move off that, one of the things they say in elections, as in military strategy, don't ever be outflanked. And it strikes me the Conservatives have got a problem, because if they try to move more to the middle and kind of combat the Lib Dems and try to maybe take some soft Labour votes away, they leave themselves exposed to Reform goblin. If they try to move out to a more extreme position and try to take the Reform vote, they will alienate some of they're in a really invidious position. Absolutely.
And to be honest, I think that's probably the challenge that's going to define this election. The ground for the Conservative Party to occupy has been severely constrained, as you said, on both wings of that. And you've also already seen Labour moving much more into the centre, which is where the party has always won elections from. Again, unfortunately, I think in terms of the quality of the debate, that means that you're going to see caution on both sides as they try and occupy almost a neutral central territory that doesn't really allow much room for innovative thinking.
But the first battle for any government is to get elected, so it's get through this. This is the Ming Wei's election for Keir Starmer.
That's right.
So let's talk about some issues that business cares about, and given all that context of where we're likely to end up, notwithstanding there's a few weeks to go to the election yet. And let's start with green issues and climate and sustainability. Where do the battle lines get drawn there? What do we likely see after July 4th?
Yeah, so I think green issues is quite an interesting one because absent the sort of downturn that we've seen in the economy in the last 2 years, the Conservatives have long seen this as a wedge issue and a point where they can differentiate themselves from the Labour Party, again leaning into some of those culture war narratives. So we've already seen them paint the Labour Party as eco-zealots. I think there was a big chunk of the Conservative headquarters who thought that this election was going to be fought on things like saying the Labour Party wants to take away your right to go abroad, they want to they're sort of part of an eco-elite, as it were, that want to implement these policies that are just beyond the pale of the normal working person. And actually, I think that's already been somewhat effective. So just before Christmas, Rishi Sunak rode back on the pledges that had been made before that by Theresa May and then by Boris Johnson. Those two prime ministers have been sort of engaged in a ratchet upwards effect in terms of the UK's ambition. Well, Sunak basically came along and rode right back on that, again, using quite populist language in terms of green elites. And it's already impacted policy. So the consequence of that was that Labour scrapped what was one of their headline policies, around £28 billion worth of investment in the green economy, something that when I was talking to domestic and international investors was obviously quite an interesting and exciting environment for them. Well, that's gone now. Again, plays into this point that we were talking about in terms of people moving into a much more neutral middle ground. So climate already being impacted by that. What we're seeing is, though, that climate from a voter point of view is falling down the register of salient issues. So only a couple of years ago, people felt very strongly about the need for us to deliver net zero. Actually, as the economy has contracted, as inflation concerns have increased, that's being outflanked by economic issues. Where the parties will be successful on green, and I think we're already seeing a shift in the way that they're talking about this, is where they're bringing together the sort of culture issues like green and economics. So when Sunak rode back from the net zero pledges back in November, he framed that in terms of it being too expensive, in terms of its impact on affordable housing, with things like requirements on house builders, as well as being sort of the preserve of these economic elites. So I guess in a way almost claiming or sort of positioning that there is no business case for green investment, whereas actually under May and Boris it was just seen as the right thing to do. But Keir Starmer, on the other hand, positioning that there is very much a business case for green investment, seeking to learn from his colleagues over in Australia by saying that if we do this, it will bring jobs, it will bring skilled employment, it will bring investment into the UK. So they're both looking at it from an economic lens, albeit from different sides.
And I think that's important because it's disappointing they rolled back on the 28 billion, and we'll see what happens when they get into government.
Indeed.
Right? Win first, then rule.
Indeed.
But I think the Australians and President Biden and the EU Green Deal all show that if you can frame this as a investment in manufacturing jobs or what the Chinese are doing, you can actually get the voter on board with that. But let's see as the election plays out.
Exactly.
And that brings me to another point that I think, again, if there's a Labour government in place, what does that mean in terms of Britain's relationship with international agencies, bodies, whether it's the European Union or where does that stand?
Well, perhaps this is implicit in your question, but certainly the people around Sir Keir Starmer at the moment will be advising him that there is a very clear risk that the Conservatives basically turn around and say Labour can't be trusted with Brexit. Obviously, the 2019 election was won on Brexit and levelling up. That's a part of the Conservative playbook, and they will be ready to whip that out if there is even a sniff that Brexit is somehow at risk, even though people, evidence suggests are changing their mind. So Starmer will be treading a very, very careful line. He'll be carrying that Ming vase all the way to the 4th of July to try and make sure that he is seen as committed to the existing path that the UK is on. I think if and when he is elected, I think significantly some of the candidates that he is ensuring are selected are much more sort of to the centre of the party like him. I think you'll then see a change in tone towards the EU. I think I would caution us to say we'll go as far to moving towards to a sort of closer union, be that on the customs side or on things like immigration, because we know that is still a salient issue for voters. But I think in areas like defence, potentially, we might see a much closer desire to much more closely cooperate. And that also comes from where Starmer is as an individual. You know, he's very much a public reformist. He talks a lot about his time running the CPS. Yeah. He comes at this from a public reform perspective. So he is actually interested in the mechanics of how international agreements work and how international diplomacy works. So I think that you will see a much more open version, both of the UK but also of the Labour Party, if and when they're in power.
Is it an unfair characterisation to say he's more of a manager than a leader?
Whether it's unfair or not, I think there's definitely a grain of truth in that. Definitely a grain of truth in that.
So on foreign policy, an issue that's featuring very strongly in the US presidential election is Gaza in the Middle East. Is that a salient issue for UK voters, and where would Labour be on that issue?
Yeah, it's very salient for a particular section of British voters. I mean, we already saw George Galloway elected last year as an independent. That was seen very much as being a sort of kick to Labour in terms of its lack of strength of position around Gaza and Palestine. And of course, the one thing that Keir Starmer keeps talking about throughout this campaign, and you're going to see him continue to talk about, is he changed the party, now he wants to change the country. He's talking about that not just in terms of the change of from the sort of left that Corbyn represented, but also obviously the problems that the party had around anti-Semitism. So again, he's got to now toe a line between maintaining much more positive relations with the Jewish community in the UK, because he doesn't want to upset all the hard work that he's done to re-establish the party as a party that can be trusted by that community. But on the other side, he's got a lot of young people and Muslim voters in particular who are upset by some of the positions that he and the party have taken on key votes in the last few months. Interestingly, though, I was surprised when he gave his platform speech earlier this week. There was a question about what he would say to Netanyahu after the attack on Rafah, and he was very clear that he would say stop, that this was unacceptable, that it was a red line that had been crossed. Now, again, that was refreshingly clear from him. Let's see, again, when you're in number 10 and you're taking advice from people in the Foreign Office and elsewhere, whether he can translate that into actual sort of clear policies that make a difference.
And last bit on foreign relations, so UK-Ireland, because it feels it's got a bit more tetchy with the Conservatives over the last couple of years, not helped by some of the characters on our side either, but a Labour government dealing with Ireland. How do you think that stands?
Well, I think first of all, he spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland through his work on the CPS. So I think he's a man that believes he understands a lot about the dynamics of the politics and the social fabric of the island of Ireland. So I think that he will come at it from a position of feeling like an informed participant in the conversation. But also, if you compare that to sort of what we had with the Conservatives, he's likely to care much less about things like cross-border trade in the way that certain parts of the Conservative Party, or obviously when they had a relationship with the DUP, certainly that they were being influenced by voices in Northern Ireland. A lot of that politics, the sort of capital P politics, will disappear. The Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer in particular, wanting to be much more conciliatory, much more open-minded and sort of small c political, or more policy and practical focused in the way that he'll seek to engage.
So Anna, closing advice. So I think, and we all know we're still in May as we record this. We haven't seen detailed manifestos, and they probably won't mean anything anyway, because my prediction is it'll be light from Labour because they just want to keep everybody happy till they can get into number 10 and see what size of a majority they have. Conservatives want to do damage limitation. So, but notwithstanding that choppy waters, any closing advice for our clients?
We're pretty much odds on for a Labour government. I think any large business worth their salt should be thinking about what that might mean for their business. I don't think it will be as big a majority as some people are talking about, but I do think that it will be big enough for them to implement some changes. And as we said, I think that there is a difference between what you will see between now and July 5th, which is frankly probably quite a policy light platform. I understand that Sir Keir Starmer basically has a manifesto in his bottom drawer and he wants it to be as short as possible. So businesses are probably not going to have a lot of detail to plan on, but after July 5th, I think that's where things could get interesting. There was a lot of talk, certainly last year, about an employment bill within 100 days, so potential changes around employment rights that would affect most every businesses with operations in the UK. We obviously talked about green and the potential for that to come back. But likewise, then there are some other specific sectors like private equity, where again, Rachel Reeves has made it very clear that she's going to be coming after the tax arrangements of people in the private equity business. Again, that's seen as a very easy win politically to fund some of the things that they want to do in other areas like education. So there's definitely some policy areas, and that's actually before we get onto things like water and transport,
yes,
where there's been talk about nationalisation.
Yeah.
We've got the potential
Don't
for
scare
a
the
new
horses.
national energy company. So there are, I think, there are some bigger policy issues post July 5th, and the debate in the next few weeks will sort of indicate. But also I think that this point about bread and butter issues and the topics that matter to voters is also important for businesses. You know, are you able to talk about your role in investment and your role in jobs and your role in skills? These are the issues that the voters care about, both from a political point of view, but actually when I was back at Hanbury Strategy, we did some work on this. It's also the issues that people most want businesses to talk about, first and foremost. They want businesses to tell them what they're doing to support customers, employers, suppliers. And I think as long as we're in an economically constrained environment, that's going to continue.
Anna, as always, fascinating. We could stay here the whole day, but thank you very much for your time. And thank you to all of you for joining us again on PwC's Leadership Exchange, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you.